This evening we will be in Luke chapter 22. You want to open up there? Luke chapter 22, and we'll end up in verse 31, as was read for us. We're going to be taking a look at this incident that's involves Peter and kind of what it means. The phrase that gets used here is sifted as wheat, which is maybe sometimes made more of than it should be. But what we're going to see is, starting with the context, exactly what is meant by this and some ways that it applies to us. So, starting with a little bit before this text, you look back at verses 14 down through 23, you see Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper. That pretty well tells you when you are, that this is the night of his betrayal. And so everything that happens after this, you're just counting down the minutes until that betrayal takes place, and then the trial, and then his death. And so we are just hours away from all of this starting. And as we go through the story, you see in verse 24 and following that a discussion arises. Of course, if Jesus has just told you that he is going to be crucified, and you need to remember him through these particular elements that we do every Sunday, that's the perfect time to argue about who is the greatest among you, right? That came up in last week's lesson as well, but that's kind of the same context here. This discussion of, well, who's great? And ultimately, greatness is through serving. Given that context, I'm pretty sure what Jesus is actually doing here, he's revealing something to Peter, certainly, but what he's also doing is giving them an example. He's saying, you're concerned about greatness, you're concerned about who's going to be most prominent in the kingdom. Let me tell you exactly what's going to happen to Peter in just a little while. And he thinks that he may be great, but this is what's already going on, and this is what's going to happen shortly after. So, looking at the text, in verse 31, it says, And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, indeed, Satan has asked for you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. He starts out by saying, Simon, Simon. Now, the strange thing in this conversation is that Jesus calls him by the name Simon. The reason that's strange is because who gave him the name Peter, after all? Well, Christ himself said, you'll be called Peter. So why does he go back and call him Simon here? And why does he say it twice, for that matter? And so it seems that the discussion starts this way because he's pointing out something to Simon, maybe two things. If you want to take this from a literal language perspective, the name Simon means listen. And so essentially he's saying, listen to what I'm about to tell you. The other thing, though, is since he gave him the name Peter, which means rock, which is a little bit more stable, maybe he's trying to say, Peter, you're going to be this in a little while, but right now, the mistakes that you're about to make, you're still kind of acting like the Simon that I met 3 years ago. And he's going to actually use his name again in Mark chapter 14, verse 37. I know that sounds like it's a distant passage from here, but that's in the garden. So it's just a few minutes after this, he's going to say to him there, Simon, could you not watch with me 1 hour? So he uses his name again, not the name Peter, but the name Simon. So then he tells him, he informs him that Satan has asked for you. That one phrase sounds a little bit scary, and probably for good reason. This knowledge has to be divinely revealed. I don't think that Jesus overheard Satan asking for Peter here, but instead God has revealed this to Christ for some reason. And it sounds a lot like, if you go all the way back in the Old Testament to the book of Job, it kind of sounds like Satan coming before God and saying, consider your servant Job. And here he's saying, hey, consider your servant Peter. Now, for us, we see this and we say, okay, so he's asking for Peter, and we know what's going to happen. It's going to turn out fine because we know the rest of the story. But what if he didn't? And all you know is that the enemy is asking for one of the most prominent of the apostles. What problem would that cause going forward? What if Peter actually does fail entirely here along the same lines as Judas does? What happens going forward? How does the church begin? It still begins, it still starts, but not the same way. And so Peter's going to play an important role in everything going forward, but here he's in danger. That's exactly what Christ is trying to tell him. and he is for now. He is in real danger. It says that he's asked for you. It's a little bit misleading, and perhaps one of your translations says it slightly different, but from Greek into English, one thing that you don't get a lot of times is in the second person. In Greek, there is a distinction between you singular and you plural, but oftentimes in English that doesn't get translated because it would have to say something like you all, but that would actually be appropriate here because this you, when it says that Satan has asked for you, is plural in the original language. So what it's saying is that Satan has asked for you all. So he is, don't get me wrong, he's addressing Peter in particular. There's something about Peter that Satan has done maybe a little bit differently, but he also is including the other apostles here. He's saying that Satan has asked for you as a group, and that you all are in danger here. But it'll actually go back to the singular in just the next phrase where it says to sift you as wheat. So it's kind of a weird order there. But he's asked for you that he may sift you as wheat. What do we mean when we say to be sifted as wheat? There's a specific reference back in Amos chapter 9, verse 9, that the household of Israel will be sifted as wheat. But we see this analogy being used by God a handful of times in the Old Testament, every time meaning judgment, every time meaning that something is going to be done that will, in the literal process of sifting wheat, you would be figuring out what parts of it are going to be saved to be made into something to be eaten, and what parts of it are useless and going to be burned up as such. Well, if we're talking about the whole of the apostles, doesn't that apply pretty well to what's about to happen? They're about to be sifted as a group. It's about to be determined who's going to be faithful to Christ and who's not. Now, that being said, are any of the apostles really faithful to Christ over the next several hours? So they all are going to fail in different ways, but one of them is going to fail completely. One of them is going to be burned up, unfortunately. Peter will be found to fail initially, but then he'll return back to Christ. But that's what's going to happen, this sifting. So again, it's not, some people take this as maybe something a little bit more mystical, but it doesn't really need to be. It's just Christ informing his apostles that Satan has asked to do what you would expect for Satan to ask to do, to tempt you, to try to draw you away from me in what's going to be the hardest part of your entire lives over the next few hours. You're all going to fail, but some of you will come back to me. And that's exactly what Christ says for Peter here. He says that, well, we'll start back with verse 32. So the first part of verse 32. I have prayed for you that that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen the brethren. So he is praying on behalf of Peter. Peter, I guess, either because of the divine knowledge that Christ has or just because it's obvious enough to him, Peter needs a little extra help here. Peter is in maybe more danger than some of the others aside from Judas, but Judas has already left at this point. He's not part of this conversation. So when he prays on his behalf, he's praying that he will not fail. I suppose in theory he's praying that he will have strength enough to not deny Christ. He ultimately does not, but he at least had the benefit of Christ praying for him. And consider that for just a minute. Imagine Christ standing face to face with you saying, I have prayed for you. I, the Son of God, who came to take away your sins, I'm praying for you because I know that you need it. Ultimately, it doesn't change a whole lot, but Christ is praying on his behalf. He even says then, when you have returned, strengthen the brethren. When you've returned to me. So he knows all along exactly what's going to happen anyway. He knows what Peter's going to do. He knows that Peter's going to fail him, to deny him. But he says, once you come back, that's when you can be helpful to me once again. And certainly he's going to be. Like we said, Peter is kind of the future of the church. He's going to be the one to deliver the initial couple of sermons that end up with several thousand people being added to the Lord's church. And he's going to be foundational, everything that goes on. And beyond that, beyond just the foundation of the church, of course, we have 2 letters written by him, 2 sermons that are given by him in the book of Acts. And so it affects even Christians today. Now, in spite of this, in verse 33, he becomes a little bit arrogant, or maybe a little bit defensive, maybe kind of wanting to show off a little bit and say, hey, Jesus, I know you're talking bad about me, but listen, everybody. Here's what I think. I would even go with you to prison and to death. How about that? And then Christ informs him, yeah, you think that now, but before the rooster crows this day, you will deny me 3 times. So Peter is warned ahead of time. There's not a whole lot that we're going to talk about with this story tonight. And this lesson is actually a little bit of a shorter lesson, so you're welcome for that. But what can we take from what this story gives us, what this account gives us? And the first thing we could talk about is humility. And this is not that nice kind of humility that you get to choose to humble yourself and become a better person over time. This is that kind of humility that slaps you right in the face and says, hey, you messed up, and now you have to change. And so this humility is that Peter thought that he was going to die for Christ, and within the next 12 hours or so, he, instead of dying for Christ, is going to be so ashamed in front of a servant girl that he denies that he even knows the man. So humility comes into the story quite forcefully there, because Peter, as strong as he thought he would be, he, very much like us, was not able to handle the situation in any real way. The second thing we can talk about is kind of a scary prospect, that this particular asking of Satan for a particular individual is maybe not all that uncommon. At least it happens with Job and it happens with Peter. And who's to say that does not continue to happen? Especially the more fearful that Satan is of a particular person. When he looked at Job and said, wow, this guy's pretty faithful. Hey, God, do you think I could try to make him change? Or he looks at Peter and says, hey, he's going to be really important in the church. Can I take a stab at pulling him away from you first? And so there is an element of fear here from Satan, but it's kind of the same as this. I'll give you this quote. This is a side point to make maybe. But C.S. Lewis, one of the all-time great Christian writers, is famous for saying this particular line about his own death. And it sounds a little bit like what we're talking about here. He says, my prayer is that when I die, that all of hell rejoices that I am out of the fight. When we talk about Peter, or we talk about Job, or we talk about anyone that Satan's a little bit worried about, that's kind of the sentiment, is that while they're still here and while they're working, it's dangerous for Satan because he's losing souls. How many souls would Peter be responsible for Satan losing? And so it could have worked out that way, but eventually Peter's going to overcome this. In spite of that idea, though, that Satan could ask for you by name to be sifted as wheat, the other side of this is that Peter was prayed for by Christ by name. And so you can say, well, it's a little bit of a scary prospect that maybe Satan's asking for you, but what's it really matter if Christ is praying for you? Now, on the other hand, Jesus did pray for Peter, right? But Peter did deny Christ. So just because even your Savior is praying for you, that doesn't take away your action. It doesn't take away your choice. And so Peter still failed even in spite of this. It was Peter's actions that made Jesus' prayer of no effect. And the same thing would be true for us. It's not that God has stopped loving us. It's not that Christ has stopped caring about us. It's that we still choose to fail him anyway. That kind of brings up a question too. Would it have been possible for Peter to avoid this? Sometimes we ask this question about Christ because Christ brings this up in the garden. If this cup can pass from me, we say, could Christ really have avoided that? Well, that's a different question. But here, could Peter have avoided denying Christ? And the answer has to be yes. He could have. It was fully possible for him to, but it didn't happen, and it wasn't going to happen. And Christ knew all along that it was not going to happen. But what would have been needed for Peter to have overcome? The first thing that we know for sure, because he's going to be told this down in verse 40, is that he could have and he should have prayed. In verse 40 it says, when he came to the place, he said to them, pray that you may not enter into temptation. Instead, Peter fell asleep. What if Peter stays up for that hour with Christ and he prays fervently that he will not enter into temptation? I don't know what the result would be, but he'd be a lot better off than falling asleep for that time period. So maybe he stands a chance there. We also could say this, that while Peter was focused on dying for Christ, if he had focused more on living for Christ, he probably would have done better. The same thing can be said for us, right? Dying is a one-time event. Dying, even for a good cause, is a one-time event. I'm not saying it's easy to do. I'm not saying any of us want to do that. But you die and it's over. But what about living for someone? How long does that last? How much effort does that take on a regular basis? See, the problem is that we have churches full of people who are willing to say right alongside Peter that they would go to prison or even face death for Christ, and then you can't get someone in the church to change a light bulb. You see the disconnect there? You could be willing to die for someone, but if you're not willing to live for them, if you're not willing to actually do something, even something small, then it's not really going to be of any effect. One other way that he might could have had enough strength to get through this, Christ tells him that when you have returned to me, in verse 32, when you've returned to me, strengthen the brethren. Well, what if instead he had been enough with the brethren, if he'd received strength from the brethren ahead of time? That is, what if he'd stayed around Christians enough? But instead, what happens after this? They go to the garden, but then after that, the shepherd was stricken, and the sheep scattered. And they did. I don't know where all of the apostles went that night, but most of them were either alone or maybe with one or two others. And so it was with Peter. If Peter had surrounded himself with the other apostles that whole night, if he'd stayed with them instead, maybe he would have done better. So there could have been strength from his brethren, but he doesn't take advantage of that. So could he have overcome? He could have. We always can overcome sin. There's always a way out if we're willing to look for it. Just a couple more things to say. One, of course, we can also say that while this story is kind of a low light in Peter's story, the end matters a lot more than what happens in this portion of the story. The end of the story is more important because Jesus knew that Peter would fail, sure, but Jesus also knew that Peter would come back again. He had full confidence that he would return to him, and when that happened, then he could go back and strengthen the brethren. He knew the story from start to finish. We don't always have that advantage, but that is the promise that we're given here, that it's the end of the story that matters, not just the things that happen at the beginning or even in the middle. And the other reminder is that Peter, in his boastfulness, in his quickness to speak here, to say that he's ready to go to prison and to death, people don't usually change. Really fundamentally, people don't change, but they can be redirected. And they can take whatever it was that was maybe more of their prominent characteristics of their personality, they can redirect those things for a better purpose. And that's what we'll see with Peter going forward in his life. But like I said, tonight, a little bit of a shorter lesson, and a simple lesson at that. But it's just to look into this example in Peter's life to say, well, this was a dangerous situation for Peter that he failed in. What can I take from it? What can I do differently when I face temptation? When I'm tempted to draw away from Christ, how do I stay close? And so we can offer that encouragement tonight to take the example of Peter, maybe do a little bit better than the example of Peter, at least here. But tonight we'll also offer the invitation, as we always do. The invitation comes from God. The invitation is to come to Him. And so if you've never come to Him to become a child of His, the Bible lays out how that is to be done. If you have any questions about that, we'd love to help. Tonight, if you need to come back to God, if you are not as close to Him as you ought to be, then this is your opportunity to do that as well. If there's anything we can help with, come forward as we stand, as we sing.